My name is Diana Foster. I am 33 years old. And 3 years ago, I walked out of a house that was never truly mine with one suitcase, no money, no plan, and the particular kind of silence that settles over you when the person who was supposed to stand beside you simply stood there and said nothing. I want to tell you about that silence first, because it was the thing that hurt the most. Not the suitcase. Not my mother-in-law's finger pointing at the door. Not even the words, "You don't belong in this family," though those words landed in me like something physical and stayed there for a long time. It was my husband, Nathan, standing in the living room of his parents' house in Phoenix, Arizona, while his mother told me to leave. Standing there with his hands at his sides and his eyes on the floor. Not defending me. Not contradicting her. Not doing the one simple thing that would have changed everything, which was to open his mouth and say, "She stays." He said nothing. I picked up the suitcase they had packed for me. I walked out with my head down. I got into the car that belonged to Nathan and drove it to the home of my friend Karen because it was the only place I could think to go, and I had nowhere else. That night, I slept on Karen's living room floor. I cried until I had nothing left. And then I lay in the dark on a folded blanket staring at the ceiling, and I made a decision that I did not yet have words for, just a feeling, somewhere underneath the grief and humiliation, that this was not the end of my story, that I was not going to let it be. I wiped my tears, and I got to work. 3 years later, on a Thursday evening in April, I heard a knock at my gate. I looked at the camera mounted above my front entrance, the gate of a property that belonged to me, purchased with money I had earned, in a neighborhood I had chosen for myself. And I froze. My mother-in-law was standing at the gate, my father-in-law beside her, and Nathan, one step behind them both, his head down, his hands folded in front of him. I stood in my kitchen looking at the camera feed for a long time, and then I walked to the gate and opened it. What they said when I did brought me to my knees. But before I tell you what actually happened, please like and subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Now, let's begin. I grew up in Tucson, Arizona, the only child of a woman named Carol who worked as a bookkeeper and raised me entirely on her own after my father left when I was 2 years old. My mother was not a dramatic person. She was practical and consistent, and she had a saying she repeated so often throughout my childhood that it became part of the furniture of my mind. The only person responsible for your life is you. Nobody is coming to carry you, so you learn to carry yourself. She taught me by example. She worked 2 jobs for 4 years to pay off debt she had not created but had inherited from my father's carelessness. She went back to school at 38 to get a certification that allowed her to move into accounting. She bought a small house in Tucson when I was 12 and painted the front door herself and stood back and looked at it with an expression I have never forgotten. Not pride exactly, but something quieter. The look of a person who has done what was required and knows it. I wanted to build something the way she had built something. I studied business administration at the University of Arizona. I graduated at 22 and took a job at a hospitality management company in Phoenix. I was good at the work, organized, detail-oriented, able to see the systems inside complicated operations and figure out where they were leaking. I was promoted within my first year. I met Nathan at 25. He was warm and easy to be with and made me laugh in the particular way that disarms you before you have thought carefully about whether you should be disarmed. We dated for a year and a half. I met his family and understood almost immediately that they were a unit with clear boundaries and a clear understanding of who belonged inside those boundaries and who did not. I believed that love, Nathan's love, consistent and apparently genuine, would be enough to move me inside.
I was wrong about that.
It took me 4 more years to understand how wrong. The Whitmore family, Nathan's family, had money in the way that some families have money. Quietly, completely, and with the particular confidence of people who have never had to think about it. Nathan's father, Richard, ran a commercial construction company his own father had built. Nathan's mother, Carolyn, had never worked outside the home and had never been expected to. They lived in a large house in the Scottsdale area and spent their summers at a property in Colorado, and they were, to the outside eye, a family of warmth and generosity. Toward each other. Toward people they considered their own. Toward me, something else. It was never crude. Carolyn Whitmore was too sophisticated for crude. It was instead a consistent, finely calibrated exclusion. The way you are excluded from a conversation, not by being told to leave, but by never being asked to join. The family stories that were told and retold at dinners without ever including me in their frame. The references to Nathan's previous girlfriends. Women from families Carolyn knew, women with the right backgrounds and the right connections, that were slipped into conversation with the innocence of someone simply remembering things. Once, early in our marriage, Carolyn had said to me in the kitchen, while we were alone, "You're a capable girl, Diana."
I'll say that.
The pause before the next sentence told me everything. Nathan has always been led by his heart. I smiled. I said thank you. I went back to helping with dinner. Nathan knew his mother. He told me not to take her personally. He said she was protective of him and that it would get easier over time. I believed him because I loved him and because the alternative, that it would not get easier, that nothing I did would be enough, that Carolyn had made her decision and the rest was theater, was too exhausting to accept. We were married for 3 years before the night they told me to leave. The immediate cause was money. Specifically, a business idea I had been developing quietly for 18 months, a boutique event management company focused on corporate hospitality in Phoenix. I had done the research. I had a business plan. I had approached a small business lender and been approved for a startup loan. I told Nathan on a Sunday evening. He listened carefully and then said he needed to think about it. He told his parents. I did not know he had told his parents until the following Friday, when we went to the Scottsdale house for dinner and Richard sat across from me with the particular stillness of a man who has already decided something. He told me, calmly and without malice, that a wife pursuing an outside business was not something he believed in for their family. That Nathan's needs came first. That the loan I had approved would create stress on our household that he did not consider wise. I said, carefully, that this was my decision to make. Carolyn set down her fork. What followed was not a screaming argument. It was something colder and in some ways worse. A conversation in which Carolyn explained, with complete composure, that I had never fully understood what being part of their family required. That I had, from the beginning, placed my own ambitions above the well-being of the marriage. That Nathan deserved a wife whose priorities were properly ordered. Nathan said nothing. I looked at him across the table. I waited. He looked at his plate. Carolyn stood up and said she would like me to spend the night in the guest room while we all considered our positions. The following morning, while Nathan was still asleep, she came to the guest room with a suitcase she had packed herself with the clothes I had brought for the weekend and a selection of items she had apparently retrieved at some point from our apartment. She set the suitcase outside the guest room door. "You don't belong in this family," she said. "I think some part of you has always known that." I dressed. I picked up the suitcase. I walked down the stairs of that large Scottsdale house and through the living room where Nathan was sitting on the couch in the clothes he had slept in. I stopped. I looked at him. He looked back at me. His face was pale and unhappy, and doing the specific thing it did when he was caught between two forces and could not locate his own position in relation to either. "Nathan," I said. Just his name. He said nothing. I walked out the front door. Karen's floor was thin carpet over concrete, and I felt the hardness of it through the blanket she gave me, and I was grateful for both the floor and the blanket and for Karen, who asked no questions that night and simply made up a space for me and sat beside me while I cried. In the morning she made coffee, and we sat at her kitchen table, and she asked me what I needed. "Time," I said. "And a plan." She gave me her guest room for 2 weeks, rent-free, with the instruction that I use the time to set myself up. I called my mother, who wired me $800 she could not easily spare, and told me, in a voice I knew was working hard to stay steady, that I was her daughter and I had her blood in me, and her blood did not fold. I spent those 2 weeks moving fast. I finalized the small business loan I had already been approved for. I registered the business, Foster Hospitality Group. I called every professional contact I had built in 4 years at the hospitality management company and told them I was going independent. 3 of them had immediate work for me. I moved into a studio apartment in Tempe that was small and impeccably clean and entirely mine. I worked in the way my mother had taught me to work, without drama, without waiting for conditions to improve, without looking back at the door I had walked through and wishing it had not closed. Nathan filed for divorce 4 months after I left. We had no shared property worth fighting over, and the process was mercifully uncomplicated. I signed the papers in a lawyer's office on a Tuesday morning and drove home, and made dinner, and watched television, and slept well. Foster Hospitality Group grew slowly, and then quickly, and then in ways I had not planned for, but was ready to receive. The first year was foundation, building the client base, establishing reputation, learning to run a business with the same attention to systems that I had applied to running other people's operations. The second year was expansion. I hired 2 part-time coordinators and moved out of the studio apartment into a 2-bedroom that had a room I could use as a proper office. The third year was the year I made decisions I had not imagined making when I was sleeping on Karen's floor. I bought a house in the Arcadia neighborhood of Phoenix. A 1960s ranch style on a corner lot with a garden I had plans for and a gate across the front driveway that I had installed for privacy and for the particular pleasure of having a boundary that was entirely my own. I moved in on a Saturday in February. I stood in the empty living room the evening of the first day and looked at the walls that were mine and the floors that were mine and the gate out front that was mine, and I felt something I recognized from my mother's face the day she painted her front door. Not pride. Something quieter. The look of a person who has done what was required. The knock on the gate came on a Thursday evening in April. I was in the kitchen making dinner when the camera notification appeared on my phone. I looked at the screen. I set down the wooden spoon I was holding. I looked at the screen for a long time. Carolyn Whitmore stood at my gate in a cream blazer, her posture more careful than I remembered it. Richard stood beside her, looking older than 3 years should have made him, his hands folded in front of him in a way that I had never seen on his hands before. And Nathan stood 1 step behind his parents, his head slightly bowed, in a posture I could not read from a distance, but that read, even on a small camera screen, as something other than the composed silence I had last seen him in. I turned off the stove. I walked through the house to the front entrance. I stood at the intercom for a moment with my hand on the button. Then I pressed it. "I see you," I said. A pause. Then Carolyn's voice, and I want to tell you that her voice was different. Something gone from it that had always been there before, some layer of composed authority that had been the constant texture of every interaction we'd ever had. "Diana," she said. "Please." I walked to the gate and opened it. The 3 of them stood on the other side. Up close, the changes were clearer. Carolyn looked diminished in a way that had nothing to do with age. Richard looked like a man carrying something he had been carrying long enough to be tired. And Nathan looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face in 4 years of marriage, which was the expression of a person who has had sufficient time and sufficient loss to finally see clearly. Carolyn spoke first. She spoke for a long time, and I will not reconstruct every word here. What she said was an accounting, not delivered with her usual composure but haltingly, with the difficulty of words that have been held back for too long and are finally being released. She said she had been wrong about me from the beginning, that she had built a picture of who I was based on what she needed me to be rather than who I actually was, that what I had built, she gestured slightly at the house behind me, was not something she could dismiss or reframe, and she was no longer interested in trying. And then she said something that I had not expected, and that dropped through me like something falling from a great height. She said that watching me leave that morning had been the first moment she had been genuinely ashamed of herself in many years, and that it had taken her 3 years to find the words for that shame and to decide that delivering them in person, at my door, was the least she could do. Richard nodded. He added, briefly, and with the economy of a man who does not use many words, that he seconded everything his wife had said, and that he was sorry. Then Nathan looked at me. I had told myself, during the years since the divorce, that I was entirely indifferent to what Nathan thought or felt, that he had made his choice in that living room, and the choice had told me everything I needed to know. I had believed this. I had built a full and genuinely good life on the foundation of this belief. Standing at my gate looking at his face, I discovered that indifference and healing are not the same thing either. He said, "I should have opened my mouth. That morning and 100 mornings before it. I have thought about it every day since you walked out, and I have not found a version of it that I can justify. I am not asking you for anything. I just needed you to know that I know. I stood at my gate for a long moment. Then I said, "Come inside. I'll put the kettle on." They stayed for an hour. We sat in my living room in my house on furniture I had chosen, and we talked carefully and with the fragile courtesy of people who share a history and are deciding together how much of it to carry forward and how much to set down. I do not have a dramatic resolution to offer you. There is no neat restoration. Carolyn and I are not close. Nathan and I are not reconciling. Richard shook my hand at the door when they left and said that the place suited me, which was the most direct compliment he had ever given me and which I accepted simply. What I have is a gate that I control, a house I chose, work that I built from a studio apartment in Tempe and alone, and the particular stubbornness of a woman whose mother told her, from the time she was old enough to understand it, that nobody was coming to carry her. They came to my gate with their heads down and their hands folded and asked me to open it. And I decided, on my own terms and in my own time, that I would. That is what belonging to yourself looks like. That is what it has always looked like. And it is worth every single thing it cost to get here.